All right, let's open our Bibles tonight to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32. We're actually getting to the end of this chapter. We will finish, Lord be willing, next week. Spend a couple of weeks looking at a couple of topical studies that will kind of lead us into the new year. And then our plan is the first Wednesday in January to begin the book of Joshua. But we begin and continue, we should not begin, we continue this evening with our study through Hebrews 11, which is a place we wanted to come before going into the land with Joshua, which really was a venture of faith. And Hebrews is a book that Paul wrote about standing, while facing persecution, standing fast in the faith. And it's a tough book to write. You know, here's a bunch of Jewish believers, converts to the faith in Christ. And while waiting for his return, which they believed should have already taken place, they became pretty discouraged. The Lord wasn't back. Their families had forsaken them. Rome was hinting around at death for believers. And they lived clearly close to that kind of action. And so they were discouraged as a church that the Lord hadn't come. Maybe you feel like that tonight. Man, I wish the Lord would come. And we wait and we wait and we wait. And the waiting just means another person gets saved today, right? And the Lord is waiting. But some had believed that maybe by turning away from Jesus and going back to their old way of life, or just simply walking away, that they could bring themselves some relief. And Paul had the difficult job of trying to convince them otherwise. It's hard when people are going through it to just convince them to stand fast. You know, that's a hard sell sometimes. Just trust the Lord. We would say that. And if you're on the receiving end of that, you might go, yeah, it's easy for you to say. But that's what he was doing to a whole group of folks, a whole set of believers. And for 10 and a half chapters, that's what Paul did. He wrote a book about how the Old Testament spoke clearly about Jesus and the fact that he would come, and that every generation has had to live by faith. And that included them as well. And from the opening chapter where he calls Jesus God in the flesh, Paul begins to show the superiority of Jesus over everything else, over the angels, over Moses. He even uses the warning lessons from the Exodus so that they might avoid making the same mistake. He promises that in the Messiah that is coming and has come, we would find rest. He talked about Jesus' preeminence over Aaron and the priesthood, that the priesthood of his was greater and longer, established by higher order and a more glorious person. And everything that they would have had confidence in, he made sure to show them that Jesus was the one. His covenant is more glorious. It's based on his faithfulness, not ours. He takes them to the sanctuary, and he walks them through the Holy of Holies and to the holy place. And he said, look at the symbolic furniture and rites practiced here. And all of them point to Jesus. And in every turn, he took these Jews, now believers in Christ, through their own history. You know, if you ever thought that you could get through the Bible without the Old Testament, think again. You need the entire Bible. And we certainly need to teach every book, don't we? But all that to get to chapter 10, verse 19, where Paul says, you know, come on, don't forsake a gathering together, as the manner of some was. You know, apply what you know to be so, which brought us to this chapter 11, which is really the best chapter, I think, in the Bible, probably on faith, in terms of its definition. 3 verses define faith in the beginning of the chapter. 19 Old Testament saints' lives exemplify it in the chapters, in the verses that follow. And God points out only that part of their lives that modeled this faith that Paul was calling the Hebrews to kind of plant, that faith that waits upon God, that faith that doesn't give up when the going gets tough. Every generation, like I said, having to live by faith. Well, tonight, we're going to start in the middle of verse 32, or actually at the end of verse 32 with the words, and the prophets. And we're going to take ourselves all the way to verse 38. Just a couple of verses away from the end of the chapter. But tonight we get a broader set of verses where the message is still faith, but the illustrations are no longer with individual names. And so instead of individual names, we are given verses that make the point that those who live by faith can suffer, that sometimes having faith means to be delivered from the dilemmas that you face, but that other times faith means being rejected, being tortured, even being killed. And yet it is still the same pleasing faith that honors him. So that faith rests in the will of God, and that ultimately faith is an end in itself. It trusts God no matter what. So our next lesson in this chapter on faith will teach us that faith in God can bring miraculous deliverance, or if necessary, provide perseverance unto the end, because faith is interested in God's will and in eternity, not in temporal solutions. Pretty tough things to learn, but so important. We finished last time a 2-week look at the men of verse 32. And if you weren't with us, it is a lesson about men who were weak in many ways in their life, and yet in whose weaknesses, though God doesn't gloss them over in the historical account, you won't find them here. This is a recording of what you did that pleased the Lord in faith. But that even amongst weak men, God still found faith and honored it. 6 men that God used to teach us that shaky faith in ordinary lives could still accomplish great things. And it was very encouraging because it literally told us that our faults, are known by the Lord, but he still loves us and he can use us mightily. That if you excuse yourself because of your weakness, that God oftentimes will not let you do that. He'll just say, come on, walk. And he uses the simple that are looking to him. He just looks for a willing heart. So let's start in verse 32. I'm hearing a lot of bottom end, Doug. I don't know if are you hearing a lot of boo? Does it sound bad to you? I sound great to you? This is exactly what I wanted to hear. This doesn't sound great to me then. You're fine. Just leave it be. Yeah, thanks. Okay, verse 32 at the end, it says this. Verse 32. And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell you of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, or of David or Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouth of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of aliens, women received their dead raised to life again. To say saints by faith were delivered by trusting in God. Now notice it starts in verse 32 with the words, and the prophets who through faith. Now we don't have any individual names anymore like the 19 we had before. This is just a general statement. And the focus here is first on the various kinds of deliverance that the prophets of God and the servants of God experience in faith. Literally, that the power of faith in God brought miracles to bear in the lives of those who trusted him. So we begin verse 33 with the words, who through faith. I want you to notice that. Not through courage, not through positive attitude, not through personality or training, not by deal making or strategy. It is our trust in God and everything that faith has been defined for us in this chapter, the same faith in God's word and character that we've been studying all of these weeks. Through faith, deliverance came to many lives. And the results are pretty wide and they're pretty varied, aren't they? This is exactly the lesson we should learn. Trusting in God will bring the right conclusion, but it doesn't always bring the same conclusion. There's a mistake that we make sometimes as Christians when we hear someone tell us about how the Lord has worked in their lives, and that we try to mimic the results by asking the process rather than seeking to just trust the Lord, his will be done. But because we want the same conclusion, well, how did you pray, and where did you stand, and who prayed with you, and what time of day was it, and what did you have for lunch, and maybe all of that matters. Well, none of that matters, right? By faith, they subdued kingdoms. Now, that's a very broad result, right, of true faith, and it could be applied in most places in the Bible, to the time of the judges, to the time like, the days of Joshua or David or the prophets, people that changed their culture, just one man or woman by faith affecting a nation. Guys like Samuel or Ezekiel or Isaiah who shook the foundations of the people who are supposed to be walking with God. In faith, we are to overcome the world and the prince of this world because we belong to God's kingdom. This worldly kingdom, is going to fail, don't you? And God's kingdom is going to succeed, right? By faith, subduing kingdoms is part of the life of the believer. We read in verse 33, by faith, they worked righteousness, or administered justice, if you will, these things that God approves of. Whenever you read the word righteousness in the Bible, just say to yourself, this is what God approves of. It is the things that God sees as right. So there were those ruling by faith in God that led to the reestablishment of things that God loved, or practices that honored the the Lord, individuals who by faith changed the way that things were done. Again, you can go to the Old Testament prophets like Elijah, against Ahab and Jezebel, changed the course of the way life was lived. Judges, kings like Hezekiah. Hezekiah came to power in a nation that wasn't walking with God, and by the time he was done, people were reading the scriptures, the temple was open for business, the priests were back at their jobs, the worship continued day and night. The place had absolutely changed because of one guy who by faith established righteousness. Nehemiah, same kind of guy, right? Comes into a situation where no one's worshiping God, and by the time you get to chapter 12 and 13 of the book of Nehemiah, the whole culture has turned around by the ministry of Nehemiah and Ezra and guys like that who brought the will and the ways of God to bear upon the people. So what does that say to us? Well, look, as Christians, we need to follow their example and seek to establish righteous practices in a day of tremendous spiritual decline, right? We're the ones walking with God and seeking to do things God's way, the things that will please him while most will not. And then hopefully and prayerfully we will be allowed to influence others in these last days for good, by faith. There are those in these days who worked righteousness, and it was always in the midst of wickedness. By faith, some of them obtained promises. Isn't it interesting that biblically correct, only faith will ever see you gain what God has promised. Only faith will get you to that point. You'll only be able to get what God has promised if you trust in him, because he makes things accessible through faith, not by works. So we believe God. But wasn't it James that said, take the prophets who speak in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and of patience, how we count them blessed to endure? You've heard of the perseverance of Job. You've seen his intended end. The Lord's very compassionate and merciful. Take them as an example of sticking with it and receiving what God has promised to provide. Paul would write it in this book in chapter 6. Don't become sluggish. Imitate those who through faith and patience inherit the promises of God. Faith will do that, but that means wait. God has made promises, and I'm sure that you're waiting on some he has yet to fulfill. When is he going to do this? When is he going to come? When is he going to deliver me? When is he going to come through? Hang in there. Heaven is yours. Peace is yours. Victory is yours. Obtain promises. By faith, some stopped, verse 33 at the end, the mouth of lions. Samson did that, didn't he? With the strength God gave him. David did that in the fields, protecting his father's flock. In fact, it taught him enough about God's power that by the time he stood before Goliath, he was able to brag to Saul, killed a lion with my bare hands. Well, go ahead then with your bad self, little David. A guy named Benaiah did it. You might not remember his story from 1 Chronicles 11. He jumped into a pit in the snow and disposed of another one of the king of the beasts, and the Lord was with him. That's more than I would want to try to do. Maybe the best example we remember of that is Daniel, right? Who by faith, with prayer, spent a night in the lion's den, and the lion left him alone. Survived it. Amazing. Being punished for disobeying the rule of law, calling on anybody but the king. He lived through it. Look, what does that mean to me? Well, the battles I face can certainly overwhelm me, be far stronger than me in a very natural sense. I have enemies that I can't overcome that seem to have dug in. However, by faith, God will show us his strength to do what we could never do on our own, and we can even have victory over hungry lions, so to speak, right? God is able. Faith does that. Faith has great power, and so does trusting in God. By faith, verse 34, they quenched the violence of fire. Well, we remember Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, right? Those three guys who found this glorious deliverance there in Daniel chapter 3 when they were told that if you hear the sound of the instruments, and the worship band playing and all kinds of music, you better fall down on your face and worship me or you'll be burning. We'll throw you into the fiery furnace. And who's the God that's going to deliver you from my hand? Said Nebuchadnezzar. Well, they didn't bow. They wouldn't bow. And they took a stance for the Lord, and God delivered them. In fact, they said to the king, well, our God is able to deliver us. And even if he doesn't, now here's faith, even if he doesn't, We can't go against his word. And when the king wrapped him up and threw him in the raging fire, you remember the story there from Daniel 3, there stood a fourth person with him in their very presence. The Lord was with them even in the fire, visibly so. And their deliverance was amazing. Pull them out of there. They didn't even smell like smoke, imagine. Nothing touched them. Well, what good was that? Well, read Daniel chapter 4. It led Nebuchadnezzar, the king, to give his life to the Lord. This guy got Old Testament saved big time in Daniel chapter 4. He wrote his own testimony, writes it all out in his own hand. And one day you're going to go to heaven and you're going to meet Nebuchadnezzar because 3 boys were unwilling to bow a knee to a king that threatened their very lives by faith. They stood. They quenched the violence of fire. They escaped, we read in verse 34, the edge of the sword. I think it was David who wrote it in Psalm 144, who delivers David, his servant, from the deadly sword. And David just understood that God had so often delivered him. I mean, you read through Elijah's ministry and Elisha, you know, they were marvelously delivered time and again from guys that wanted to kill him. Marvelous deliverance. Hezekiah is spared by the Assyrians, though they could have killed him. Gideon routs the Midianites. I mean, you can make a whole list of folks who, trusting God, found themselves escaping certain death. Faith. How powerful is faith? And how often God has stepped in to deliver us who are trusting in him. We're like lambs in the midst of wolves, aren't we? And yet God keeps us. We are told in verse 34 that by faith there were many out of weakness made strong. We just mentioned Gideon, and we talked about him a few weeks ago. You know, he had so little hope to be in anything in life. He saw himself as worthless. He saw their situation as hopeless. He lamented that their past had a great God. Their present and future didn't seem to have him involved at all. And this weak man crying out for God's help, God took forward and taught him where strength was to be found. Remember Sarah and Abraham, too old to have kids, found out of weakness they were made strong. He remembers our frame. He knows that we're dust. In fact, if you read Caleb's story, his best work was done after he was 80 years old. We always write 80-year-old people off. You're 80. Just sit down. Caleb went, I'm 80. Give me the mountain. I got my boys with me. We're going to take out some enemy. And you can go read his testimony there, you know. What does Psalm 1 verse 3 says? You can be as a tree planted by the rivers of water that brings forth its fruit in its season. Doesn't matter how old you are, just where you're planted. It says in verse 34 that there were those who by faith waxed valiant in battle, turned to fight the armies of the aliens, became valiant or waxed valiant, as it says in the King James, in battle. Victory over the enemy, even when you're outnumbered, confidently going forward. You're never, by the way, in the majority in a worldly sense. The church has never one time been in the majority. You're always going to be the fringe group, the weirdos, the right-leaning, head in the clouds, trusting in God weirdos. That's us. I wish I had a shirt that had all that on there. I'd wear it. But with God, we're a majority, aren't we? And you can't allow the observable or obvious hindrances to you to keep you from trusting that that's true. Faith will do that. It'll give you a good view of who you're walking with and whom you're serving with. The Amalekites were defeated by Moses' army in Exodus 17 just because Moses held up his arms, and Aaron and Hur held up Moses' arms, and Joshua and the men were fighting in the valley. And they won. They won. They were a bunch of meandering, wandering Jews in the wilderness. They had no clue. They hadn't fought. They'd been prisoners of war for generations. And they won because God's hand was upon them. They had victory over the enemy. I mean, the Bible is filled with those who by faith found out that God is able. And I like that, to know that, because we can get easily discouraged with, you know, the world's opinion of us, or the way the country's going, or the lack of morality, or just the minimizing of the Lord and his being set aside. He's not set aside in our lives. He's powerful in our lives. He's faithful. So we're not going to lose the battle. We're going to have victory in him. The world won't see it, but we'll see it. Verse 35 says, women receive their dead raised to life again. You know, Elijah stretched himself out on a dead son for a widow who was crying out to God for his life, and prayed for this child and picked up this boy and carried him down to his distraught mother there in 1 Kings, I think it's chapter 17. Elisha, watching and being an understudy to Elijah, was faced with a Shunammite woman whose son had also died. And he was mad, and he said to the Lord, "Why didn't you tell me? Could have went in there and prayed." But he went, and like Elijah, was used by God to bring this child back to life. Well, the point is, faith brings immeasurable power to your life. And what these Jewish believers needed to know, maybe more than ever before, was that God would keep them, and they would be overcomers. They would find victory. They weren't going to lose. They're going to win. God has power you don't know anything about. And for these Jewish saints to live under the darkening skies of Nero's impending rage and lunacy, you know, God wanted them to know that he delights in bringing mighty triumph into the lives of those who walk with him. You should know that too. Rather than becoming discouraged and lamenting and woe is me, and you're constantly caught up in the political life of the world, look, get caught up in the life of the Savior. He brings victory for you. It pleases him that you trust him, and he empowers those who look to him. Just look at this list. Don't you want to make a list like this? God can deliver the faithful anytime he wants. Noah and his family, while the rest of mankind drowns in unbelief. Moses and Israel through the Red Sea, while a purely dominant world power, Egypt, gets drowned in that same sea. Joshua and Israel going over the Jordan and beginning to fight a Canaanite bunch of people that were far stronger than the Jews would ever hope to be, and yet they didn't stand a chance when the Lord was first. Gideon, overwhelming odds. He wins. David runs from Saul and the entire governmental machinery for 7.5 years and finds himself to be king. And God makes him probably the greatest king that Israel ever saw, brought Israel to heights that they hadn't known, simply by a young man who trusted him. Weak, yep. Sinful, often. But God was able. So women received their dead to life again. There was a deliverance, there's a power that comes with trusting God that is far beyond our capability oftentimes to believe or to reconcile. But look what God has done through those who trusted him by faith. Forget the 19 specific examples. Just look at the big overall view of the kind of things that God can bring to bear, that faith overcomes. It overcomes literally everything. But here's the parallel truth, and it starts in the middle of verse 35, where we read these words: others were tortured. They wouldn't accept deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had a trial of mocking and scourging, yes, of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were tempted and slain with the sword. And they wandered about in sheepskins and in goatskins. They were destitute and afflicted and tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. And they wandered in the desert and in mountains and in dens and in the caves of the earth. Here's the parallel truth to what you should know about who God is, and that is, there's another side to examine, because God has not promised wholesale deliverance in this life for everyone. The same faith that overcomes may also be able to bring you to a place where you have to die to maintain that pleasing character that God is looking for. Sometimes faith is just, I'll give it all up, God. Whatever you need from me, that's going to be worth it to me. And I place my emphasis on the eternal rather than the temporal. It's not less faith. It doesn't say in here others, because they had less faith, were killed and murdered and thrown off the cliff and wandered through the hills. It doesn't say because they had less faith than these guys before them, they weren't able to get fully out of the problems that they found themselves in. It doesn't say that at all. It's not less faith. It's not weaker faith. It's simply finding God's will to be something other than our original intention and request. So you get these following verses to balance out what true and biblical and persevering faith looks like. God does great things through faith, powerful things, brings great deliverance, and sometimes just enables you to die and to stand fast, not taking compromise. So here in the middle of verse 35, God gives us some examples of equally glorious, pleasing faith that would persevere unto the end, that would keep its eye on the eternal, that would care little for the temporal losses that it would face by walking with God, and saw them nothing by comparison to what awaited them. So if you want to write, what else does faith do? Faith has the power to preserve you or cause you to persevere unto the end. Verse 38 might say it best. It's a character in the heart of a man before God that makes him unworthy to the world, of whom the world is not even worthy. So we read in the middle of verse 35, others were tortured. Now there is an example of faith I would not like to follow. We may have heard that faith ought to keep us from such things. That's true, and it does from time to time. But it may very well not. The truth is sometimes living by faith, following Jesus, puts you in direct line with suffering. If the world hates you, what did Jesus say? You know it hated me before it hated you. What did it do to Jesus? They killed him. What will they do to you? Maybe the same thing. Some missionaries are led by faith into the worst of situations where difficulty is the norm, where suffering is a way of life, where death is possible every day, just for your faith. Well, you got to be called to go there. One of our missionary guys called me last year and he said, hey, I want to go to Iraq. I want to sneak across the border and do some studies. You want to go with me? And without even a blink of an eye, I said, let me pray about that. No. All in one sentence. Let me pray about that. No. And he went. And that's where he feels like God's called him to go. And I went, I'm not called to go there. God bless you. Put you on my prayer list. But if God is working by faith, you might not be delivered. God won't leave you. God won't forsake you. You'll have an eternal home. But you may get there quicker than you had planned. And God will not always keep you from trials simply because you believe in him. He'll deliver you through them, from them, or through them, right? God will either get you through or get you out. God doesn't always keep you from the trials that you are facing. All of the apostles, with the exception of John, who suffered, if you believe at least the writings from the first century, many physical trials, including trying to boil him in hot oil, according to the early church writers. But everyone else, every one of the other apostles was murdered for their faith. Hey, I want to live in Jesus' day. I want to be an apostle. Really, do you? No, you don't. They died, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. In other words, they faced, difficulty, and rather than recanting their faith, they chose to die. Look, I don't think the American church has ever faced much physical persecution. We get made fun of, and people point out how weird we are. And, we're not like at the top of the society's choice. But we haven't faced much physical challenge. The early church, in the first 10 persecutions under the Romans, millions, 6-7 million Christians were killed in a couple hundred years. And all for one thing, they believed God. Burned at the stake, thrown to the lions, lit on fire with pitch to light up the Caesar's walkways in the palace. Horrendous. Read Fox's Book of Martyrs sometime. It's not a good read, but these guys went to the graves like the boys of Daniel's day. They were unwilling to save their necks by denying their Lord. And the deliverance offered would have brought physical resurrection, so to speak. They'd have lived to speak another day. And they said, no, we don't need to live another day. Our faith is for this life and for the next life. We want the better resurrection. We value the eternal over the temporal. And if choices had to be made, they made the right one. On a much less stressful level, you and I are called to live for Jesus in this culture. And it can be hard, and it can be costly. It can be difficult, especially as the environment seems to grow increasingly more hostile. You can stand against sin and be called every kind of possible name in the book. You still got to do the right thing, don't you? Well, what if we're not delivered? Well, then you still do the right thing. You want to go to heaven with a smile on your face. Lord, I did the right thing, not with your head hung in shame. You can lose a job over it. You can lose friends over it. You can lose promotions and income. Eternity has to predominate your choices, don't they? And the same with these guys. They died not accepting deliverance. They put first things first. And in either event, faith would lead us to put Jesus first no matter the cost or no matter the consequence. Verse 36 said there were others who had trials of mocking and scourging, cruelty, chains, and imprisonments. The word mocked is a word for creating or producing mental anguish, the suffering that you just can't handle it in your head. The word scourge means just that, whipped and beaten. They preferred suffering to compromise and released. You know, I always am so amazed that Paul was a pretty stubborn guy, right? Type A, stubborn guy. And I love watching him just stand. But his very greatest strength could also be his greatest weakness. When the Lord wanted him to go to Europe, it took him months to figure out that that's where God wanted him, because he tried to go everywhere else first. And it wasn't until he got to the coast and he went, well, we're out of real estate. The Lord went, yeah, you ready now? Let's go to Europe. But that stamina that Paul showed, you know, when you're beat up in a city and dragged outside and thrown rocks at you till they think they've killed you, and then you wake up and you're not dead and you go right back into the town looking for a hotel room, that's a tough guy who's really not put off very easily. But you see Paul doing that in Lystra. In Philippi, he and Silas took a beating simply for praying for people and preaching the gospel and the fruit that came. And they could have spoken up because they were Roman citizens. They could have said, you can't beat Roman citizens, but they decided not to say anything. In fact, they didn't say anything until the next day that they were released. And then they said, hey, by the way, you beat us. We're Roman citizens, so here, leave the church alone. And they used it as kind of a pawn over the heads of the city governments to leave the church alone, and it worked. Joseph was in prison for years for being faithful. Jeremiah was in prison for a long time simply for being a faithful man, for speaking out against the Lord. The princes were angry with Jeremiah because he shared the gospel with people in the Old Testament sense. And for that, they made him go to prison. Jeremiah 37, verse 15, for they had made that the prison for him because of his speech. Sometimes you just get in trouble for walking with God, but you can't stop doing that, and you certainly can't hide your faith. And these folks didn't. They didn't. They would not accept deliverance. They were instead interested in the eternal thing, even if that meant beating and chains and imprisonments. And worse, verse 37, they were stoned. Now, that doesn't mean you in the 60s. This means the rocks thrown at you. Right? Israel's full of rocks. And in history, often that became the murder weapon of choice. Zechariah, the son of the priest who brought God's word to the people in rebellion, got stoned right by the temple. Let me just take this guy out and kill him because he's telling us the truth. Jesus, when he was weeping over the city of Jerusalem, said, the one who kills the prophets and stones those that are sent to her. He was aware of their suffering. They were faithful. Now, that's extreme according to what we've seen, but the lesson is the same. The experience is extreme. Nobody's stoning you today or tomorrow, not in this country. But true faith in God will still put eternal rewards over the cost that is short term, right? You still got to live for Jesus. I don't know how you're doing that, if you're hiding your faith or not saying anything or just pretending to know. I don't know. These guys in faith stepped up. They were, notice it says they were sawn asunder. They were cut in two. Now, there's no biblical record of this happening to anyone, but the Haggadah, the Jewish Haggadah, has a section in it called the Ascension of Isaiah that tells how Isaiah was sawn in two by two false prophets of Manasseh after the death of Isaiah's friend Hezekiah, the king, and how the prophets stood by gleefully rejoicing and laughing while Isaiah prayed to the Lord as they cut him in two with a wooden saw. It's in the Haggadah. God mentions it here. We don't have a record of it in the Old Testament, so you're fine to set that aside if you like. But it happened to somebody. Rather than walking away from the Lord, they took a death that was horrifying. Stoned, cut in two, you take your pick. They were tempted, and then they were slain with the sword. They were tested. Their faith was put on trial, and they were killed with a sword. Many died at the end of the sword for their faith. The same faith that verse 34 said, quenched the violence of fire and helped them to escape the edge of the sword. Verse 37 says they ended up on the tip of the sword. Same faith. For one, God brings life. For the other, death. Both same faith. Both pleasing in his sight. Faith delivers to life and it delivers to death. They wandered around in sheepskins and goatskins. They were destitute and afflicted and tormented, and they wandered in the desert, in the mountains, in the dens, and in the caves of the earth. They persevered, didn't they? With little to no gain in this life, deprived of the essentials of life, even the simplest comforts or the meager existence that came with it. They did so for his sake. They did so by faith in God. They honored the Lord, and they were mentioned by him as God rejoicing over them. So faith can work both ways, right? The ultimate end is you trust God for whatever. Faith brings great power. Power to persevere, power to overcome, and power to stand not accepting anything else. Powerful. The faith that God wants to work in your life. And the irony is mentioned in the first part of verse 38, of whom the world was not worthy. The world had rejected these they really did not deserve to have. They had an example and they trampled it underfoot. Their faith so far removed from this world of selfishness and sin, and in their poverty they pleased God while the world didn't want anything to do with them. I hope that the next time you hear one of these false prophets on TV telling you that if you have faith you should be rich, maybe you could tell them to read the entire Bible. Because here's a list given to us by God himself of saints who were so set apart and filled with faith that the world wasn't worthy to contain them, and yet they were called upon to persevere and to be deprived and to die. And how could they do that? They lived by real faith in him. Well, look, the church needed to hear this from the pen of Paul because they were ready to give up. It was getting bad, man. No, we don't face what this young church faced. What's the worst that could happen to you as a Christian in this culture, really? What could they lean on you with that would really destroy you? Not anything that these folks, were facing. But Paul wants to be clear and say to them, God will see you through, or he will give you strength to stand for him. We may not always find deliverance. The choice is up to him. Our only obligation is to be faithful and to trust him wherever and whatever. And that's enough for God to be pleased with. It isn't the way that so often faith is taught. Well, you didn't have faith. If you had faith, you would have had this, right? The consequence of faith. Did you get it? Well, then you didn't have faith. No, faith is an end in itself. It pleases God just simply because it stands upon what God has promised. When Jesus spoke to Peter there at the end of John 21, he said, when you're young, you can do whatever you want with yourself, but when you're old, they're going to stretch out your hands, and somebody's going to tie you up, and they'll carry you where you don't want to be. And he talked to him about the way that he was going to die, and everyone understood that. John wrote it as well. And when Peter turned around and saw John standing there, he said to Jesus, what about that guy? Okay, you told me how I'm going. How's he going? And the Lord said, don't you worry about it. If I want him to stick around till I come back, that's up to me. You just be faithful. And then the word got out, well, John's going to live till Jesus comes back. It's not at all what the Lord said. Or maybe Acts 12 is a good example. Herod arrests both James and Peter same day, and it pleased the Jews who hated the church. And so he killed James. And Peter was left in prison for the weekend through the holidays, through the religious time, so that after the Sabbath, he was going to be brought out, and Herod was going to kill Peter because he was on a roll. He thought he was doing a good thing. And Peter gets broken out of jail by an angel, right? It's the angel breaking out of jail deal. And you read and you go, wait a minute. It's got to stink to be James. Peter gets this great miracle story, and off he goes. Well, God's sovereign. Both had faith. No matter if it's deliverance by faith or perseverance by faith, it's still faith, isn't it? So here in these verses, we get clearly from God this understanding that faith pleases the Lord, but the consequence of faith, though it can be great power, can also just be great perseverance. Stand by faith. Wait by faith. I know we would all like to be up in these upper verses, wouldn't we? Subduing kingdoms, working righteousness, obtaining promises, stopping the mouth of lions, quenching the violence. of fire escaping the edge of the sword, out of weakness made strong, valiant in battle, turning the fire of the enemies, women receive the death. Oh, that's what I want. Others, no, I don't want others. I just want that first part. Well, both comes with it. Next week, we are going to finish the book. Look what we have to do, 2 verses. I hope you're ready. If you have time, read ahead. And then we were going to have 3 weeks of topical studies I think you're going to enjoy. We're going to look to focus on a new year. And then the book of Joshua will begin. Father, as we sit together tonight to have communion and to spend some time in worship and thinking about your great sacrifice for us, may we be reminded that there are certainly enough examples in the Bible of men and women who were faithful in their walk of life, in their trust in you, and yet the consequence of their faithfulness was tremendous suffering and pain and loss and death. So much so that you declared of their lives, the world really isn't worthy of the example of their faithfulness to the bitter end. We think about missionaries who live without family, with little, sometimes in very harsh circumstances, out of sight of the church, which labors constantly with first world problems. My air conditioning doesn't work. The cable didn't come on. Rather than I don't have anything to eat and I think they want me dead. And that you have given, Lord, your grace to those who have given their life. But that you might teach us tonight that faith is that quality of life that puts your word and your ways before anything else. That it can drag the future promises of God into the present tense so we can enjoy them. The peace of knowing you're going to come through, the joy of realizing we can't lose, the hope that passes all understanding and yet is as solid as can be for the life of the saint, that we might live and walk by faith, not measuring faith by what we got in return, but recognizing that faith is at best embracing you, Lord, and your word, and your character, knowing that you're for us. You're not against us. You're going to bless. You're going to use us. You're going to have your way. And in the end, we're going to stand before you to hear, well done, good and faithful servant. So tonight, wherever you're at, and maybe you're going through some stuff and God hasn't seen fit to answer your prayers yet you've been praying without ceasing, don't quit. But be convinced of this. God knows what you're asking for. God knows your heart, and he knows what he's going to do. And you can rejoice in that, because his choice for you will be the best choice for your life. And who knows? Maybe that miracle that you're looking for will be headed your way soon enough. But the greatest miracle will be you learning that you don't need that miracle to love God and to trust him. That comes without saying. You've come to know the character and the heart of God. You love him with all that you have. Tonight, that's our prayer for you, that your faith would stay strong in the Lord, in the power of his might, in his promise, in his goodness, in his love. He will accomplish what he has promised you. He is on your side. He knows your dilemma. He sees your needs. And he is greatly pleased with you just believing that and trusting in him. Tonight, after we dismiss, if you need prayer for what you're facing, we'd love to agree with you in prayer. Let's ask God to do the great things that we want, the impossible. Let's ask. You have not because you asked that. Let's ask. But then let's rest knowing that his ways will be right. We're going to have some of the folks from the bookstore and from the thrift store serve you communion tonight. So would you hang on to the cup and the bread till everyone's served, and then we'll partake together. But as we're serving, let's spend a couple of minutes just worshiping our God. He's worthy to be praised, is he not? He's more than able to do beyond what you can ask or think. He's coming again. He's going to come rule and reign. He's going to have the last laugh and the last word. And for us who want to live with him and live for him, we're going to rule and reign with him one day. And it's going to be awesome. But tonight he rules and reigns in us, and that's awesome too. So as we sing, lay your cares at his feet. That's what the Bible says. It says, just cast your cares upon the Lord, for he cares for you. And you can do that tonight. You can just leave your worries, your anxieties, your wishes, your wants, your frustrations. Just leave them with him. And go your way with what God has given you, a joy and a peace and a hope, a promise, his presence, his spirit. If God be for you, who can be against you? Well, he's for you. He's for you tonight. So let's worship him and go home with peace that he's our God.